Welcome back. April 20th, 2021. It strikes me that we have so many disparate understandings of goals and ethoses that the disparity comes from a deliberate disrupting of our common culture, and by that I mean Western civilization. You've heard me discuss the crisis of the West, the notion that we no longer believe our creeds anymore. But it's something else entirely when we don't know the creeds. It's one thing to know them and dispense with them, another thing altogether not to know them. This is part of the memory hole as well. George Orwell put it this way: every book has been rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street and building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and that process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Endless present. Milan Kundera, you've heard me on this before, as someone who saw his country disappear, he knew what it meant to have a culture rewrite its history as well, so that new history could be written, which of course is not history. History, Orwell was right, was stopped in America. At least it was stopped when Western civilization was put on the chopping block. But you never know where your next coalition is going to come from. Or as the famed Harvard president Charles Eliot put it, in the campaign for character, no auxiliaries are to be refused. Next to despising the enemy, it is dangerous to reject allies. Thus now comes one of the most prominent leftists, indeed Marxists, in the country, Princeton University's Cornel West. He writes in the Washington Post today to scold Howard University for ditching the teaching of Western civilization. Howard University being one of the country's most famous historically black colleges. There was a push, starting with Malcolm X, I suppose, and continuing through postmodern intellectual circles, that it was cultural rape or something like that to force people of color to understand, no, never mind revere, the West. After all, that was the white man's work, wasn't it? Well, what a shame. As if even that were true, white people should not read black authors, just as black people should not read white. But it's not true. Ethics and philosophy are colorblind and have nothing to do with a person's skin color. As Harry Jaffa put it in 1989, providing a white education means teaching white mathematics or white economics or white biology or white physics or white political science. There's no such thing. Was there anything in Plato's Republic that indicated it was white justice that Socrates was seeking to define or discover? Was there anything in the Nicomachean Ethics to indicate that it was white happiness that Aristotle sought as the summum bonum? Was there anything in Locke's second treatise of civil government or the Declaration of Independence to indicate that taxation without representation was unjust only for whites? Was there anything in Locke's Letters on Toleration or the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom to indicate that it was only in case of white human beings that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry? Although I hammered away at these questions, Jaffa wrote, the opposition was always uninterested in debating them. The philosophers have hitherto interpreted the world, Karl Marx had written. The point is, however, to change it. Debate, like religion, had become, in their minds, only an opiate. You defeated your opponent's argument by trampling on your opponents and by treating them with contempt. That was 1989. In any event, this is why the West matters. It is the culture and philosophy that gave us religious and civil liberties, among other things, and Cornel West nailed it in his open letter to Howard University, writing this, among other things, I quote at length, "Upon learning to read while enslaved, Frederick Douglass began his great journey of emancipation, as such journeys always begin, in the mind. Defying unjust laws, he read in secret, empowered by the wisdom of contemporaries and classics alike to think as a free man. Douglass risked mockery, abuse, beating, and even death to study the likes of Socrates, Cato, and Cicero. Long after Douglas's encounters with these ancient thinkers, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would be similarly galvanized by his reading in the classics as a young seminarian. He mentioned Socrates 3 times in his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. Cornel West is quite right. Frederick Douglass, who became more literate and beautiful a writer than the likes of, say, Toni Morrison or even James Baldwin. And Douglass taught himself to read and think by spending 50 cents on something called the Columbian Orator at age 12. In that orator, Douglass was exposed to the speeches of Washington, Socrates, Cicero. He was instructed on diction, how to speak. Not a bad education, that, and he read it and reread it and reread it. And of course, Martin Luther King, named after one of the great men of Western religious tradition, wrote this, quote, "Not until 1948, when I entered Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, did I begin a serious intellectual quest for a method to eliminate social evil. I turned to a serious study of the social and ethical theories of the great philosophers, from Plato and Aristotle down to Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, and Locke. All of these masters stimulated my thinking, such as it was, and while finding things to question in each of them, I nevertheless learned a great deal from their study." Close quote. Yep, that's where you learn to go about social evil, all right. Once upon a time, when words like justice mattered, and we agreed on those words, and words like evil mattered, and we agreed on those words because of a common understanding of common culture, we were a better society for it. As William Bennett would put it about King, King studied Western philosophy to know the answers to certain questions. What is justice? What should be loved? What deserves to be defended? What can I know? What should I do? What is a man? As a result of the way in which King answered those questions out of and through the Western tradition, Jim Crow was destroyed and American history was transformed. I have no objection, in case anyone is interested, to students studying cultures that are not Western. That's just fine. But they should not be denied access to the best and greatest philosophical tradition in the world, the one that has transformed societies around the world, the one that is the intellectual and moral and political currency not only of the world that developed in the West, but for all people. And students, black or white, would all be better to imitate what Martin Luther King did rather than this trend coming out of some curriculum boards. But now we deprive these children this exposure to education because of the color of the skin on the men who wrote and taught us about justice and love and natural law. If you were the grand dragon of the KKK and wanted to keep black children down in America, the best thing to do is to keep the best of our tradition, intellectual, moral, literary, from them. Just let the white kids study that. Instead, make believe with the black kids that they are all going to live in Africa and that what is most important to them is to become experts in obscure African history rather than experts in the society in which they are going to live. Talk to black children in America and ask them what they want to be. Talk to white children in America and ask them what they want to be. They will tell you the same thing. These are our children. They are American children. They are entitled to the best we have to offer, Western, Eastern, black, white, whatever. We should give all of our children the best we have to offer, but understand that it is only the Western tradition that opens itself up to the study of other traditions. Other traditions do not open themselves up to the study of Aristotle and Plato and the Bible. Back to Cornel West. He writes, Howard University is dissolving its classics department. Academia's continual campaign to disregard or neglect the classics is a sign of spiritual decay, moral decline, and a deep intellectual narrowness running amok in American culture. Those who commit this terrible act treat Western civilization as either irrelevant and not worthy of prioritization or as harmful and worthy only of condemnation. Sadly, in our culture's conception, the crimes of the West have become so central that it's hard to keep track of the best of the West. We must be vigilant and draw the distinction between Western civilization and philosophy on the one hand and Western crime on the other. The crimes spring from certain philosophies and certain aspects of the civilization, not all of them. This might be a good time or place to remind what I constantly try to remind of. Not all of this country had slavery. Indeed, the majority of it did not. And those fighting to defend slavery did, in fact, lose to the majority that fought to end it. The Western canon is, more than anything, a conversation among great thinkers over generations that grows richer the more we add our own voices and the excellence of voices from other places. We should never cancel voices in this conversation, whether that voice is Homer or students at Howard University. For this is no ordinary discussion. The Western canon is an extended dialogue among the creme de la creme of our civilization about the most fundamental questions. It is about asking what kind of creatures are we, no matter what context we find ourselves in. It is about living more intensely, more critically, more compassionately. It is about learning to attend to these things that matter and turning our attention away from that which is superficial. Howard University is not removing its classics department in isolation. This is the result of a massive failure across the nation in schooling generally, which is now nothing more than the acquisition of skills, the acquisition of labels, and the acquisition of jargon. Schooling is not education. Education draws out the uniqueness of people to be all that they can be in the light of their irreducible singularity. It is the maturation and cultivation of spiritually intact and morally equipped human beings. The removal of the classics is a sign that we as a culture have embraced from the youngest age utilitarian schooling at the expense of soul-forming education. To end this spiritual catastrophe, we must restore true education, mobilizing all of the intellectual and moral resources we can to create human beings of courage, vision, and civic virtue. Students must be challenged. Can they face texts from the greatest thinkers that force them to radically call into question their presumptions? Can they come to terms with the antecedent conditions and circumstances they live in but didn't create? Can they confront the fact that human existence is not easily divided into good and evil but filled with complexity and ambiguity? This classical approach is united to the Black experience. It recognizes that the end and aim of education is really the anthem of Black people, which is to lift every voice. That means to find your voice, not an echo or an imitation of others. But you can't find your voice without being grounded in tradition, grounded in legacies, grounded in heritages. Engaging with the classics and with our civilizational heritage is the means to finding your true voice. It is how we become our full selves, spiritually free and morally great. Thank you, Professor West, author of Race Matters. The Western canon is morally great. Now go tell the rest of the movement that wants to scrub it, indeed that openly declares it aims to disrupt the family tradition of the West, the Western family tradition, which is the heart and soul from Aristotle and the Bible to modern times of all Western life. As Dr. Bennett put it even years earlier, we are part and product of Western civilization, that our society was founded upon such principles as justice, liberty, government with the consent of the governed, and equality under the laws, the result of ideas descended directly from great epics of Western civilization, Enlightenment, England and France, Renaissance, Florence, and Periclean Athens. These ideas, so revolutionary in their times, yet so taken for granted now, are the glue that binds together our pluralistic nation. The fact that we as Americans, whether Black or white, Asian or Hispanic, rich or poor, share these beliefs aligns us with other cultures of the Western tradition. It is not ethnocentric or chauvinistic to acknowledge this. No citizen of our civilization should be denied access to the best that tradition has to offer. I'm glad Cornel West gets it. I wish more would. We'd have more Frederick Douglasses and Martin Luther Kings Jr. then, wouldn't we?